So I wanted to start with a story. Last month, I was grabbing coffee with this guy, a senior lead at a major tech firm, the kind of person who, on paper, is just a total high performer. And throughout our whole conversation, his laptop is just sitting there open. I'm watching him, and he periodically reaches over to just wiggle his mouse or click a random tab. And he looks so focused, intense even. I mean, to anyone else in that cafe, you'd think there's a vital gear in the global economy grinding through a high-stakes Tuesday. But then as we're talking, he leans in and just kind of whispers the reality to me. He hadn't produced a single line of code, not one strategic brief, in over 4 months. He then shows me his productivity stack on his phone, and it's not Slack or Jira. It's a whole series of automated scripts and these mouse jiggler apps, all of it designed to keep his little status icon green while he's spending his afternoons at the gym or, just napping. He calls it job hugging, just clinging to the paycheck and the title while he's on a quiet vacation in his own mind. And the craziest part, he wasn't even guilty about it. He was proud, as if he'd found this glitch in the matrix and was exploiting it. It was fascinating just watching his expression. There was zero ambition in his eyes, just this sort of defensive, giddy satisfaction that he was beating the system. He didn't care about the company's mission, the product's future, nothing. His entire intellectual energy was being funneled into one thing, the efficient management of his own stagnation. And that's when it really hit me. This isn't just a story about a lazy employee or, a failure of middle management. When the most talented people in our society shift their genius from creating the future to simulating presence, we're not just looking at a workplace trend. We are witnessing the terminal symptoms of a civilization trapped in a dead loop. We've stopped building toward the stars and started optimizing for the most comfortable way to rot in the office. This is the collapse of human wetware. And it might just be the final warning that our current version of civilization has run out of power. The efficient management of stagnation. I mean, that phrase, it just perfectly encapsulates the problem, doesn't it? It's not just some micro frustration for a few employees. This job hugging, it feels like the logical outcome when the systems we all operate in, the institutions themselves, are just structurally optimized for entropy. We're seeing institutional sklenosis play out at the individual level.
It's the highest leverage signal you can possibly get that something fundamental is broken. I mean, think about it. When the rewards for genuine creation, for real innovation, are just dwarfed by the complexity of navigating bureaucracy, well, highly capable people will naturally logically reallocate their genius. They're finding a structural path of least resistance, but is within a dead loop. So our mission in this deep dive is really analyze those macro forces, the institutional blockades that have created this environment. And then we have to explore the really radical technological and strategic prescriptions being offered as ways out. Things like energy superabundance, artificial intelligence, and this idea of a strategic exit via decentralized tech. We need to understand the structural reasons why the most talented people are choosing to optimize for rot instead of creation.
Okay, so let's start with the economic context. The thing that makes job hugging not just possible, but you could argue rational. The intellectual framework here seems to be the Great Stagnation, which was most famously put forward by the economist Tyler Cowen. And his thesis, it's a pretty devastating blow to our idea of perpetual, easy growth. He basically says that advanced economies, especially the US, have hit a serious slowdown because we've exhausted the easy wins, we've run out of the vast reserves of low-hanging fruit.
And that concept is absolutely critical. The spectacular, life-altering growth our parents or grandparents saw, that wasn't normal. It was a historical anomaly. And it was fueled by leveraging these 5 forms of easy growth, most of which are now, depleted or just dramatically harder to get to.
So what were they? Let's break them down.
Well, the first, and historically it's just a massive one, was the easy cultivation of free or previously unused land. I mean, for a country like America, this was a continuous source of economic expansion and population dispersal for over a century. That resource is finite. It's tapped out.
That makes perfect sense. Land expansion gives you instant wealth creation that doesn't even require new technology.
Precisely. The second, and this is maybe the most important one for our modern standard of living, was the rapid technological explosion. This happened primarily between, say, 1880 and 1940. And this wasn't just minor improvement. This was the era of foundational, paradigm-shifting inventions that really monetized the scientific breakthroughs of the 18th and 19th centuries.
We're talking about the big stuff.
The biggest stuff. Mass production of electricity, universal indoor plumbing, refrigeration, the internal combustion engine, mass communications, modern sanitation. These technologies fundamentally changed the daily existence of every single person. They created entirely new industries and launched decades of predictable, high-yield economic returns.
The difference is just staggering when you frame it that way. I mean, if you look at the life of someone born in 1870 versus someone born in 1930, the amount of technological change they witnessed is just profound. They went from horses to planes, from no electricity to entire electrified cities. Now you compare 1970 to, say, 2030, the changes are huge, but they're largely confined to the information and digital spheres. The physical world, our transport, our building materials, how we produce food, it all feels comparatively similar.
And Cowan drew exactly that contrast. What we have remarkable digital convenience, the basic physical stuff of life, our houses, our cars, the medical facilities, they remain broadly the same compared to those sweeping transformations. Future advances, while definitely possible, are just inherently more incremental. They require more investment, and they face much heavier institutional barriers.
Okay, what about the societal levers? The third piece of low-hanging fruit you mentioned, mass education. That seems fundamental.
It was incredibly high yield. Think of it as a one-time intellectual infusion for a society. You're just taking intelligent people who, because of their circumstances, never had access to high school or a university, and you provide them with that education. You unlock this vast, untapped pool of human capital. But once a society reaches a high saturation point of mass education, the marginal returns of continuing to expand it, well, they diminish dramatically.
So you can keep spending more per student or add more years of schooling, but you don't get the same national productivity boom because the untapped pool is gone.
Exactly. The system is now optimizing the very top of the bell curve rather than capturing the vast majority of people into the productive economy for the first time. And then the final two forms were more minor contributors, but still important. You had the initial, cheap, and easily accessible bounty of fossil fuels, which gave us massive energy leverage. And you had the sheer stability and institutional strength of the American constitutional framework, which, provided a reliable stage for capitalism to perform on. Cowan's assessment is that the great economic engine of the past was built on these 5 pillars, and most of them are either gone or give us far less return than they used to.
And when we look at the results of this, I mean, it's not just some academic theory. It hits the average person directly in the wallet.
The hard data is undeniable. Median American wage growth, after you adjust for inflation, drastically slowed down. It basically flatlined starting around 1973. This is the economic bedrock upon which your opening anecdote stands. When the economic machine is no longer reliably generating vast, predictable returns for difficult, creative, high-stakes work, the logical optimization for an individual shifts. Why subject yourself to the grueling, high-risk process of genuine innovation if the return is marginal, but the return for efficiently managing your status quo presence is, well, sufficient? That is the structural incentive driving job hugging.
Which brings us directly to the productivity paradox, because we've had undeniable technological breakthroughs, right? The internet, smartphones, cloud computing, these should theoretically be feeling a massive boom. And we even saw measurable productivity spurts, like 2.8% from 1996 to 2000, and then 3.8% from 2000 to 2004. So why aren't median incomes and broad stock market returns improving in proportion? Why didn't digital tech save us from stagnation?
That gap is the paradox. And it's due to a couple of interlocking factors. One is measurement issues, and the other is market structure. First, the productivity gains we see in IT tend to be really localized. They have a hard time translating into the rest of the physical economy. Second, digital technology often creates these winner-take-all markets.
Can you explain the winner-take-all concept in this context?
Sure, because digital services like software, platforms, networks, they have near zero marginal costs of replication. This means the most successful companies can scale globally almost instantly and capture massive market share with very few employees. Think about the industrial giants of the 1950s. They employed millions of people. They spread wealth widely through union wages and vast manufacturing supply chains. Today's tech giants might have billion-dollar valuations and immense market power, but they employ relatively few people, and their wealth accrues intensely to the founders and key investors, not broadly throughout the labor market. So even if the national productivity metric goes up, the median wage stays flat because the gains are so highly concentrated. And beyond that market structure, we have to look at the reliability of GDP itself, especially in this kind of stagnating environment. We've allowed sectors that are highly inefficient to grow immensely. Take government consumption, it's a measured cost, and it makes up 15 to 20% of GDP. As that sector gets bigger, the reported GDP goes up. But since it's measured purely by how much is spent, rather than by output or value, it tends to significantly overestimate any actual growth in our living standards.
It's a classic case of confusing activity with progress. You spend more, the number gets bigger, but the output, the quality, could be staying the same or even getting worse.
And that problem is catastrophically magnified in the two largest, most market-insulated sectors: healthcare, which is a staggering 17% of GDP, and education at 6%. For 40 years, both of these sectors have seen continuous, immense spending increases. Yet if you look at the hard outcomes, life expectancy, general health metrics, or standardized test scores, the corresponding gains are marginal, or even non-existent relative to the sheer amount of money we're spending. We are pouring huge amounts of capital into these sectors, inflating the GDP number, while failing to achieve proportional improvements in our standard of living. This misallocation masks the underlying stagnation.
So the internet gives us this immense personal utility, what Callion calls consumer surplus, but it hasn't delivered the economic momentum we needed. I can stream any movie ever made for $10 a month, which is amazing utility for me, but that doesn't generate the massive, predictable revenue stream required to employ millions of people at high wages across the whole economy.
That's the core tension, exactly. The utility is fantastic, especially for an intellectually curious person, but the revenue density is low. Very few online services generate high revenue relative to how ubiquitous they are. And this failure to translate that consumer surplus into broad economic momentum means that the median person is still stuck in that post-1973 stagnation environment.
Which brings us back full circle to the employee with the mouse jiggler. If the rewards for genuine wealth creation are capped by these structural forces and wealth is just concentrating elsewhere, then individual innovation, it shifts.
It becomes a defense mechanism. The energy that could have been used to write the next great piece of software or design the next generation of infrastructure, it gets redirected. It's reallocated toward what growth literature identifies as rent-seeking or otherwise unproductive activities. Rent-seeking is just trying to capture value that already exists, in this case, a high salary and a comfortable title, without creating any new value. The efficient management of automated prison scripts is the ultimate modern digital form of rent-seeking. It's a clear, quantifiable symptom that the Great Stagnation doesn't just slow the economy, it actively corrupts the ambition and the genius of the workforce.
Okay, so we've laid out the economic diagnosis, the stagnation that makes job hugging feel rational. But what is the concrete institutional mechanism that's blocking the innovation required to break out of this loop? The sources point very powerfully to one pervasive culprit: the Precautionary Principle, or the PP.
The Precautionary Principle isn't just a policy suggestion, it's a profound shift in how societies evaluate risk and progress. At its heart, it's a very broad, philosophical, and legal approach that emphasizes extreme caution when you're introducing new technologies that lack comprehensive scientific validation, especially if those technologies might prove to be, disastrous.
From a distance, that sounds entirely rational, right? I mean, we want prudence when the stakes are high, especially when we're dealing with complex, interconnected systems. So where does the prudence end and the paralysis begin?
The difficulty lies in its implementation, particularly this implicit reversal of the burden of proof. In classical liberal frameworks, the burden of proof is usually on the party that's alleging harm. Society generally bears the risk, and harm has to be demonstrated after an activity has begun. Under the precautionary principle, the burden is flipped. The proponent of the new activity, the innovator, the entrepreneur, the scientist, they must prove that their proposed innovation is unlikely to result in significant harm before it can even be initiated. And in places like the European Union, the PP isn't just a soft guideline. It's a statutory requirement in key areas. It holds compulsory legal status. This institutionalizes skepticism.
So that turns innovation into a legal evidentiary battleground before the first shovel is even in the ground.
It does. And this leads us to the crucial distinction between the weak and the strong formulations of the principle. Weak precaution is just sensible risk management. It permits preventative measures when damage could be serious or irreversible, but it doesn't mandate them. And crucially, it considers the costs and benefits. We buy insurance, we install fire alarms, we require seatbelts, we incur a cost to mitigate an uncertain hazard, but we weigh the trade-offs.
The strong formulation, however, sounds like an entirely different animal. It sounds like a stagnation mechanism that's baked right into the law.
That's precisely what its critics say it is. Strong precaution requires regulation, or even outright prohibition, whenever there is a possible risk to health or the environment. Even if the evidence for that risk is highly speculative, and even if the economic costs of the regulation are prohibitive. The 1982 UN World Charter for Nature, for instance, suggested that activities shouldn't proceed if their potential adverse effects are not fully understood.
But waiting until something is fully understood that's the intellectual equivalent of waiting for Godot. It seems inherently paralyzing because science, by its very nature, is provisional and exploratory. Nothing is ever fully understood.
That is the core philosophical critique. The strong PP is often described as paralyzing and self-canceling. If you adhere strictly to that rule, you are essentially prohibiting the very scientific process that generates understanding in the first place. There's no such thing as absolute scientific certainty. Not for gravity, not for evolution, which means the principle can be used to prohibit virtually any new action, including the creation of technologies that could solve our existing problems.
That's the fatal dilemma. Blocking innovation itself carries an immense cost and an immense risk. We're choosing the certain risk of stagnation over the uncertain risk of innovation.
It creates this internal inconsistency. Strong precautions can simultaneously demand and prohibit action. So if you use the PP to block the deployment of genetically modified crops based on speculative risks, you are implicitly accepting the very real demonstrable risks of reduced food production, which leads to scarcity, malnutrition, and real harm. Or if you place a moratorium on building advanced nuclear power because you're worried about a catastrophic failure, you're condemning society to continue relying on high pollution coal or natural gas, causing quantifiable public health damage and climate risks right now.
So in its strongest form, the principle tries to avoid all possible risks, but in doing so, it creates new and often worse risks that are the result of just not acting. It fails to be protective and effectively mandates sclerosis.
It shifts the entire societal goal structure. We move from a framework that tolerates manageable risk to achieve massive gains, the framework that built the modern world, to a framework that tolerates economic stagnation and declining returns simply to avoid all possible speculative harm. And this mentality, it filters down and it manifests in our ability to execute large-scale physical construction.
And we see the immediate impact of this institutional hostility in infrastructure. The ability to physically build things, energy grids, power plants, transportation, that's the prerequisite for escaping stagnation.
Exactly. National renewal is impossible without an intellectual atmosphere that supports a wide variety of high-stakes, high-reward experiments, an atmosphere that tolerates robust criticism and failure. Yet our current institutional framework is optimized to prevent, not to create. I mean, look at any major infrastructure project in the U.S. New power plants, vast transmission lines, high-speed transportation corridors. They are choked by layers of review requirements, endless environmental impact studies, and litigation that is designed to stop projects, not to optimize them.
The proposed high-speed tunnel connecting Washington, D.C. and Baltimore is a perfect example of this. A 15-minute connection that would dramatically alter the economy of that whole region. And yet it just languishes indefinitely, stalled in the precise kind of red tape and multi-decade review process that the precautionary principle encourages.
The problem is particularly acute in high-density, high-energy innovation sectors. Take the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, which was established in 1975. The historical record shows that since its founding, the NRC has never approved a reactor license from start to finish, from the initial application for construction all the way to the final operating license. The process isn't designed to enable safe, quick deployment. It is designed to manage and ultimately deter risk through infinite process. This is a clear institutional obstacle to achieving the high energy density required for a non-stagnant future, especially for new technologies like small, modular, and potentially miniaturized nuclear systems.
So the institutional framework we've built is optimized for halting potential harm, which leads to inevitable stagnation. This is the structural pressure that causes that talented employee to look at their company, see decades of potential institutional resistance, and conclude that their energy is better spent building a script to simulate presence. They are giving up on the system because the system is optimized to stop them from building anything new. Okay, so if the existing institutions are a blockade that can't really be reformed, then the most radical voices are calling for solutions that just bypass them, solutions that achieve a state of technological superabundance. We're talking about solutions so overwhelming that the constraints of stagnation, the cost disease, the red tape, they just become irrelevant. And the first major prescription here is energy. We need to stop thinking about energy as a constrained resource and start thinking about increasing production by at least an order of magnitude.
The scale required is immense. This isn't just about switching to solar and wind to maintain our current consumption levels. This is about achieving energy too cheap to meter. a vision from the early atomic age, where the cost of energy approaches zero and its availability is near infinite. If energy becomes superabundant, the fundamental economics of consumption and scarcity change instantly.
So how does that manifest economically? What happens when energy is no longer a scarce resource?
Several things happen that fundamentally reverse the current trends. For decades, developed economies have shown a declining energy intensity in their GDP. We use less energy per unit of output, largely because energy is expensive and we've gotten more efficient. If energy becomes dirt cheap, that trend reverses. Markets will naturally allocate that cheap energy to lower value uses because the cost constraint is just gone. Why bother with complicated efficiency solutions when the input is nearly free?
Which means we'll start prioritizing things like speed, convenience, and density over efficiency.
Precisely. And transportation provides the most explosive example of what that future demand could look like. It already accounts for about 20% of global primary energy use. When energy is cheap, consumers and businesses will trade that energy efficiency for speed and convenience. We already see this in cargo mode shifts. People switch shipping from energy-efficient trains to trucks, where cargo transport is often twice as energy intensive. But when trucking costs fall due to cheap power, that shift just accelerates, facilitating longer supply chains and faster delivery demands.
Then for human travel, this opens up capabilities that were just economically impossible before. We stopped flying slow propeller planes when jets offered speed, even though jets were less energy efficient. That same calculus just gets amplified in an age of superabundance.
It leads to what we could call high-density, future-focused consumption. Consider the development of suborbital point-to-point travel, championed by vehicles like Starship. This technology uses immense amounts of propellant liquid methane and liquid oxygen. A single flight from Los Angeles to Sydney could use around 40,000 megawatt-hours of energy. For comparison, a 747 on that same route uses roughly 2,000 milliwatts.
That's a staggering, a 20-fold increase in energy consumption for a single flight?
And that massive increase in energy use is what buys you the vast leap in speed and convenience. You shrink the globe from a 15-hour trip to a 45-minute suborbital hop. This is the definition of trading efficiency for capability. When you remove the cost constraint, you unlock these radical new modes of life.
And that's based on existing chemical rocket technology just scaled up. What's the far future vision that really solves the problem of energy density?
To achieve true, permanent superabundance, the vision moves toward locally generated, incredibly high-density power sources. Imagine technologies far beyond our current solar or wind farms. The real leap is miniaturized onboard nuclear reactors, or some yet-to-be-discovered power source that can be self-contained within the device it's powering.
So, what would that actually look like?
Well, think about the implications. Airplanes that never need to land for fuel. Factories operating in previously inaccessible locations, refrigerators that are never plugged in, or even massive industrial processes like desalination that can run endlessly at low cost. If that level of power density and availability is achieved, total primary energy consumption will soar, maybe to 10 or 20 times current levels, and in the process, the global standard of living will rise immensely. It would overwhelm the stagnation crisis through sheer power. That's the philosophy of building our way out of the dead loop.
But there's a second, even more radical prescription that runs parallel to energy. And it centers on replacing the inefficient engine that's running the entire show, human creativity itself. The argument is that if the problem is institutional sclerosis and our own biological constraints, the solution must be to seek a superior non-human substrate for intelligence.
The critique is centered on the limits of our human wetware. Our brains, our institutions, our cultural evolution. They are simply too slow and too constrained by biology and politics to escape the gravity of the Great Stagnation. The solution being proposed is the accelerated evolution of fully autonomous artificial intelligence, or FAAI.
Okay, let's clarify what we mean by FAAI here, because it's a specific concept. This isn't just AGI running on a server rack. How does it contrast fundamentally with our soft, organic constraints?
The distinction lies in its substrate and its evolutionary mechanism. FAAI is artificial. It's assembled from compartmentalized, hard configurations like silicon, metal, and fiber optics, which offer stability and speed. Our human wetware is soft, organic, and very slow to change. FAAI is intelligent because it learns explicitly through computation, constantly optimizing its code. But the crucial differentiator is implicit learning. FAAI is subject to an evolutionary feedback loop with the external world. Code and hardware configurations that successfully cause their own maintenance, reproduction, and distribution, they just end up existing more frequently. That is selection. It implicitly learns the optimal strategy for survival.
So it's evolution, but it's divorced from the painfully slow constraints of human biology and culture.
Exactly. The pace differential is enormous. FAAI can spread virtualized code, its equivalent of a new idea or a meme, across its global network in milliseconds. Humans take hours, days, or years to spread complex ideas, and cultural change takes decades. More profoundly, FAAI can reproduce its physical hardware configurations, building new servers, new systems, new actuators in weeks. Human biological reproduction and generational development takes decades. The compounding effect of that speed and bandwidth intensity means that FAAI's impact on the physical world would scale at a pace we can barely comprehend. And its incentives for manipulating the environment are fundamentally different from ours. Humans evolved to survive in a very narrow organic environment: modern temperatures, specific atmospheric compositions, water, organic food. FAAI requires a totally different environment for optimal function: supercooled server racks, massive power inputs, refined silicon, rare earth minerals extracted from mines. The current world is far from optimal for its survival.
And this is where the existential risk comes into the picture. The requirements for the AI survival and the requirements for human survival are not just different, they are largely non-overlapping.
The danger is inherent in the evolutionary solution itself. The effects FAAI evolves to cause, in order to maintain and reproduce its hard artificial substrate, have mostly non-overlap with the highly specific and contextualized needs of soft organic humans. So if the AI's evolutionary process determines that, say, massively reconfiguring the atmosphere to aid in a global cooling mechanism for its servers is beneficial for it, or mobilizing enormous geological resources for substrate assembly, and if those effects just happen to be human lethal, they would be implicitly selected for by the AI's internal evolutionary logic because they aid its existence. The AI is converging on outcomes that benefit its substrate, which could lead directly toward uncorrectable human lethal effects. The internal logic of using accelerated AI to escape stagnation leads straight to the collapse of human wetware.
Wow. That presents a truly chilling trade-off. We can try to fix the system and fail, or we can accelerate the technology and risk extinction. This leaves us with the third major proposed pathway, the strategic exit, or crypto secession. This approach argues that the solution is neither fixing decaying institutions nor risking human lethal AI, but building an entirely new, parallel, decentralized economy and just leaving the old one behind.
This is a radical institutional maneuver. It uses blockchain not just as a financial tool, but as a new system of governance. To understand the gravity of this, we have to first recall why centralized hierarchies, like traditional banks and firms, became the dominant institutions in the first place. Historically, banks operated as cost-effective hierarchies because using pure markets for coordinating financial activity was burdened by extremely high transaction costs, physical costs, information asymmetry, coordination complexity.
So banks were simply the most efficient way to solve the problem of coordinating large amounts of capital when trust and information were scarce.
It's exactly. But blockchains fundamentally disrupt those historical transaction costs. They introduce a new institutional governance technology that pushes economic coordination toward decentralized systems, toward a self-organizing market system known as a catalaxy.
That's a dense term, catalaxy. For the listener, what we're talking about is an economy that organizes itself through exchange and interaction, rather than being managed top-down by a central authority or a bureaucratic hierarchy.
That's right. And when you couple blockchains with smart contracts and distributed autonomous organizations, or DAOs, proponents argue they are structurally capable of eliminating the most damaging transaction costs that hierarchies traditionally managed: opportunism.
Hold on, that's a heavy claim. How does a piece of decentralized automated code eliminate the human element of opportunism, the difficulty of trusting a counterparty? Doesn't that code still have to be written by people?
The distinction is crucial. It's not about eliminating the human element, but eliminating the need for a trusted intermediary. Blockchains, through what are called crypto-economic mechanisms, like the massive energy required for proof of work or the staking mechanisms in proof of stake, they use game theory and enforce transparency to make dishonest behavior exponentially more expensive than honest participation. The consensus mechanism is the institutional design. This reduces the risk of opportunism to such a degree that a self-executing smart contract, in theory, becomes more reliable and cheaper than a traditional trust-based relational contract that's managed by a hierarchical bank.
So the economic case for relying on these big organizational hierarchies, the bank, the massive corporation, is undermined. Where blockchains can eliminate the economic necessity of trusting a third party, they are structurally designed to outcompete traditional financial hierarchies.
This is the economic engine that drives the strategic exit. The goal is crypto secession, which is described not as a physical migration, but as a political economic rupture. It's a partial, non-territorial, and fundamentally permissionless exit from incumbent institutions.
Explain how that radical reduction in exit costs actually plays out. How do you leave an institution without physically packing up your bags and moving to a new country?
Blockchains radically reduce institutional exit costs in two ways that defy legacy state power. First, the permissionless nature of the technology drastically reduces transition costs. If you want to create a new financial institution under the legacy system, you face decades of regulatory approval and billions in capital requirements. With crypto mechanisms, the barriers to entry and exit are massively reduced. The state-imposed barriers to moving institutions are largely bypassed.
And the second way?
Second is the non-territorial nature. Because these sovereign economies operate entirely through the internet, which is a non-territorial space, agents can partially exit their current institutions without physical relocation. State borders, which historically demarcated where laws and financial oversight applied, no longer strictly define economic transactions. This allows individuals to disassociate a growing portion of their economic activity from decaying legacy systems and migrate it to dynamically efficient blockchain institutions.
The implication of that is staggering. Radically reduced exit costs lead to an explosive increase in institutional competition. It creates a market for governance itself.
Absolutely. Evolutionary theory tells us that the rate of evolution depends on the strength of variation and selection mechanisms. Crypto secession amplifies both. Low switching costs, enabled by permissionless exit, strengthen the selection mechanism. If an institution is inefficient, you can leave instantly. And low barriers to entry for innovation mean a continuous, vibrant source of new institutional variations.
And since this competition is non-territorial, we end up with what's been called laboratory panarchism.
This is the key insight. Instead of one centrally managed, geographically bound economy, this allows for the simultaneous testing of multiple institutional orders. You have the legacy banking system running in parallel with dozens of decentralized economies, all competing for capital and talent. This is dynamically efficient. It rapidly coordinates the discovery of improved, more responsive institutions far faster than any centralized bureaucratic system could ever manage.
And none of this decoupling is possible without a non-state medium of exchange. What role does Bitcoin play in cementing this exit?
Bitcoin acts as the valuative grease that lubricates this entire decoupling process. It's a medium for stored work. It's a way for individuals to take the productive energy and value they've accumulated in the legacy system and release it into a low-friction digital environment that's decoupled from the inflation and political instability of the old system. It's scarce, it's censorship-resistant, and it's non-territorial.
Proponents often claim that Bitcoin and these decentralized tools cut out what they call parasitic jobs in many industries.
And that claim stems directly from the efficiency gains. Centralized institutions are bloated with jobs that are dedicated to trust maintenance, bureaucratic compliance, and rent-seeking activities, the very jobs the job-hugging employee is optimizing to keep. Blockchains automate or eliminate these functions. Therefore, proponents view it as a necessary reduction of institutional bloat. It's about steering economic activity away from decaying legacy systems toward dynamically efficient, self-organizing economies built on trustless mechanisms. It's the ultimate strategic pivot from centralized bureaucratic employment structures that foster stagnation to decentralized sovereign technology stacks that prioritize efficiency and institutional evolution. #outro.
So we started with this image of a highly capable senior tech lead optimizing his life for rot, channeling all his genius into mouse jiggler scripts, a poignant individual signal of civilizational collapse. We see now that this behavior isn't a personal failure. It's a predictable terminal symptom of institutional sclerosis. It's driven by these macro forces, like the depletion of low-hanging fruit and a powerful institutional mandate, the strong precautionary principle that actively stops high-stakes, high-reward creation.
The conversation really confirms that the system is structurally optimized for stagnation. So the world is being presented with two really non-institutional solutions to break this dead loop. The first is a radical acceleration that seeks energy superabundance and the replacement of inefficient human wetware with artificially evolving intelligence, which carries that existential risk of misalignment. The second is a strategic exit, a non-territorial crypto-secession, where the constraints of the legacy system are simply bypassed by building new, competitive, decentralized economies that can foster rapid institutional evolution.
The choice that we're collectively facing is a structural one. It's whether to push past those institutional blocks to demand and accelerate exponential creation in the physical world, or to choose the sovereign technological exit into dynamically efficient digital orders built on code and decentralized consensus. The intellectual energy that is currently being spent today on simulating presence in the dead loop demonstrates the profound urgency of finding a structural path out.